Dr. Ronald Kovach is the American, he is the Chief Executive Director, American International Accreditation Association of Schools and Colleges, USA. Dr. Kovach, we request you for the system and the how the schools are accredited in your country.
Yes, thank you very much, distinguished chairman, and nice to meet everyone here. And I'm very honored, as everyone is, to be with such a distinguished panel. My organization accredits 225 plus schools with an American curriculum throughout the world. We are an international accreditation agency, and we're about to launch also a college and university accreditation service. My perspective tonight is as both an American educator as well as having a background in both higher education and K through 12 education, and as an educator working with international schools. So our session, as we've heard and as we know, focuses on safe campuses and curriculum rationalization. But what that means is a practical application of knowledge to achieve a desired end. And to that issue, my remarks will center on 3 recent documents that address the future of education in a post-COVID-19 world. So I narrowed down my remarks for today to focus on these 3 reports. One is from the RAND Corporation, and that is a US policy think tank. And they have some ideas on the topic that we're talking about today. The second is a report from the US-based Cisco Corporation. And the Cisco Corporation recently put out a paper on reimagining the future of education. And then finally, the UNESCO International Commission on the Future of Education, which comes under their 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So very quickly, the common thread that runs through these 3 reports I will address, but there are some important permanent impacts that COVID-19 has had on the future of education. We all know that from here on in, that the future is blended. It is blended with both online and virtual experiences, and that perhaps can be a silver lining in the pandemic, post-pandemic world, which I will address in a second. But also what was somewhat disconcerting was the emphasis on all 3 of these thought pieces on these issues: the digital divide that still exists, but was amplified with all schools around the world being caught essentially off guard in a crisis. The education gaps, the income inequality, certainly poverty, and the gender inequality. And so with somewhat limited resources to make this move in this crisis, these issues we should all be aware of as educators and work where we can in our respective positions and in our respective countries, and also throughout the world, to address these inequalities that have been amplified. Certainly we know in all of our countries, and I'll certainly speak to the US because it has happened here as well, the number of students who do not have access to internet, that do not have access to instruments by which they can engage with their classes and engage with their learning. And this has, whether it's in an urban setting or in a rural setting, has certainly amplified these issues, as I've mentioned. And that certainly has to do with income inequality in many circumstances. But I'm not going to focus my remarks on those. I just sort of present them as a prerequisite for any discussion that any of us should have about what is the future of education. We have heard in previous speakers talking about certainly a safe campus, and we know that for students to learn, that they have to feel socially and emotionally supported, and they need to feel safe. They need to be engaged with their peers and with their teachers. And good relationships with other adults and their teachers is important. My remarks focus, I think, a bit on how do we create lifelong learners. So the silver lining from my perspective in both the States and internationally is in the issues that came up that caught everyone off guard in this crisis, in this international crisis. But it allowed us, I think, an opportunity to see the value and the importance of technology and education. And that now that we have engaged the world in this new way of learning, we are not turning back. And even though we will soon return to face in the classroom, I think it is imperative for education leaders to focus on the fact that technology is now part of learning. It is no longer the sage on the stage of a teacher, whether it's in K through 12 or in higher education, being in front of a classroom and thinking that their speech, that their knowledge is something that can only be imparted through their lips. I think what online learning has proven and has demonstrated is the importance of self-directed learners. And you cannot have a child in fourth grade, hypothetically, being online for 6 or 7 hours. Most of us who are parents and grandparents know that we want to limit the access that students have to technology. And all of us have said, you've been on your Chromebook, your iPad too long. You need to get off and pick up a book or something like that. Well, now we're in the situation where we're requiring students to spend 6 hours or more online learning. Sometimes we have to re-engage and we have to recalibrate the way that we teach by considering the fact that when we do return to the classrooms, that we need to integrate the online resources and the tools with the face-to-face learning. And that is very imperative. We also know that teachers have not been trained. There were many teachers, some of whom were at the highest levels of the degrees in their field, who had no idea of how to teach online. Coming from a higher education background, most of my career, I can tell you numerous times how many faculty have said, I don't want anything to do with this online learning stuff. I'm old school. I'm going to be teaching in front of people till the day I leave this profession. Well, we know that that's certainly changed, hasn't it? So everyone, by choice, kicking and screaming, or by desire, have now become online educators. But what have we done as an infrastructure within our school systems? We all know, and I'm certainly preaching to the choir, so to speak here, because we all, I'm sure, share this. But the aspect that I wanted to touch on is how do we create lifelong learners? Well, we have to engage them in their own learning. Previous speakers have mentioned metacognition. I think that we should all be advocates for that. Students need to be able to reflect before they can apply. So experiential learning, which we have heard, and I've spent a good deal of my career engaged in professional organizations and opportunities for experiential learners, is that reflection is the key. So reflection often means, especially in our current online environment, is shutting down the computer and saying to students, you need to do these tasks and then come back on. They do not have to be engaged, plugged in to the classroom from dawn to dusk. They need opportunity to reflect, to engage in research, to learn how to learn. So the metacognitive approach is how we can impact creating lifelong learners, because metacognition and reflection and learning how to learn and emphasizing those types of neuroscience and cognitive science research that's out there informs us that if students know how to learn, no matter what in the future they encounter, that they can adjust and be flexible and be agile. So you can learn and you can memorize, but the important thing is, how do you adjust? Well, sort of the microcosm experience that we've all had is that we've all had to adjust. And it's been extremely difficult for many people, for educators in general, not to speak of parents and teachers, in the sense that it seems as if sometimes, to quote a phrase, we're drowning in information while we're starving in wisdom. We're drowning in information while we're starving in wisdom. So we have to adjust ourselves to create the infrastructure for teachers and students to inform ourselves continuously in the way the technology informs education, because it has changed now forever. We can say for the better, or we could say for the worse, but we have to adjust. And the important thing in some of these reports, I have mentioned the use of learning analytics, the emphasis on assessment is also important in how do we get students to apply what they're learning. In the virtual world exclusively, if we don't send students out of their seats outside in hopefully safe circumstances where they can learn to apply what they've learned, or even doing it within the comfort of their own home in these circumstances, then we have missed the mark. We simply couldn't take the old model of the sage on the stage and transfer it to the
Dr.
digital.
Kovach, may I request you to conclude it within
Yes.
one minute, please, because we
Thank
have time constraint.
No, thank you very much. So I think that the emphasis of these three reports, again, the Cisco report, the RAND report, and the UNESCO report, says that providing education, engaging content for students, ensuring there are supplemental resources, that the supplemental resources previously used are now the core. They're no longer supplemental, they are core, the digital resources. Sharing online teacher-created resources and empowering very timely student feedback. And finally, to use tools that are easy to implement. But again, considering, harkening back to my original comments, overriding all of this is the inequality that we must address, because we know there are high percentages of students who have lost an opportunity to learn based upon innumerable circumstances. And so I certainly appreciate the opportunity to address these. I think as educators, we need to continue to read these thought pieces from policy centers that have done research, that have the statistics and the analysis that look at what has occurred and what we do moving forward. So thank you very much for this opportunity.